take a look at current events and issues through the lens of the values of our university, the Northwood idea. And so this year, the theme that we've chosen is economic freedom and development. And in my opinion, and I think it's shared by many people that do research in this field, economic freedom has been one of the great developments of the 20th century. As more and more countries have moved to free up their economies, we've seen a dramatic decrease in poverty around the world, dramatic increase in literacy rates, dramatic increase in human rights. And if you look at where those things progress the farthest and the fastest, it's in those countries which are the freest. And that includes freedom in all its different aspects. But in particular, those countries that have the most economic freedom are also at the forefront of progress in many social measures. However, I think I and many others detect a troubling trend with respect to economic freedom. People who keep track of these things, for example, the Fraser Institute publishes an annual index which keeps track of economic freedom around the world. And economic freedom around the world has been decreasing in recent years after increasing for the previous 2 or 3 decades. So certainly we hope that that trend is, that it's not a trend, that it's just a temporary thing. Maybe it has something to do with COVID. Maybe it has something to do with geopolitical climate we're in right now. But we're here to emphasize again the importance and the benefits of economic freedom for economic development. And we're here to examine some of the policies that governments or even businesses are following, which are threatening economic freedom and causing it to fall around the world. So I hope that we can learn a lot today, and I hope if you do like the presentations that you've heard today, that you will continue to attend these events. There are 3 of them. The next event is going to be March 16th and 17th, and there's one again in April. So go to our website, northwood.edu /freedom-seminar, or just Google Northwood University Freedom Seminar to get the entire schedule of events. At this point, I want to give a shout out to the McNair Center, which is sponsoring the Freedom Seminar as it has every year for the past 10 years or so. We're gathered here in the McNair Lecture Hall on Northwood University's campus. So again, we want to thank the McNair Center for their generous support. Today, the focus is going to be on global aspects of economic freedom and development. And we're going to be hearing from a number of people from various parts of the world, and they're going to be giving their perspective on what's happening to economic freedom. And I think it's going to be very enlightening, especially for we Americans who are not necessarily tuned in to events around the world as much as we should be. We should learn a lot today from our guest speakers. Next time, we're going to be focused more on economic freedom as it relates to the United States, public policy here in this country. And then finally, in April, we're going to be moving to Dearborn, and we're going to be touring Greenfield Village. We're going to look at the history of entrepreneurship and the way that entrepreneurs, and in particular in those areas where they have the freedom to pursue their dreams and their ideas, that leads to economic development. We're going to take a historical perspective there. So, global, U.S., historical perspectives on economic freedom and development. That's the Freedom Seminar this year. We're very fortunate today that Mamiko Reeves put together today's lineup. She has reached out to our international partners around the world, and I want to welcome them right now. We have, as many of you are aware, we have educational institutions or agreements with educational institutions in many different countries. And so joining us online today, there are your fellow students, fellow Northwood students from China, from Sri Lanka, from Switzerland, and many other places. So whether you know it or not, we're a very international institution with a strong international presence. But this is really the first time we've tried to include our entire Northwood community in this event. So I want to welcome our friends from abroad, and I want to welcome all of you who are here in person. Our first presentation today is from Manizha Wafeq. I hope I said that right. She's from the Afghanistan Institute for Economic Empowerment of Women. A little bit about our first speaker. She's an entrepreneur. She's a campaigner for women's rights. She's trained more than 500 government staff in Kabul and provinces on gender mainstreaming, and more than 250 businesswomen from Kabul and provinces. She's going to speak to us today about how life has changed in Afghanistan, especially for women and for girls. She established the Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry in order to promote and facilitate women's professional networking opportunities in Afghanistan. So would you please welcome Manizha Wafeq, who will be joining us online this morning. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I hope I'm audible and as well as I can be seen and my camera is working. Thank you for the introduction. And it's an honor. Thanks to Momiko for thinking of me and inviting me today to speak to all of you. And on a very important topic, economic freedom. Economic freedom for a country like Afghanistan, which was going towards economic freedom until August 15th, 2021. But unfortunately, the whole process of Afghanistan, Afghan people and Afghan women going towards economic freedom and development was paused. Afghanistan was very much economically dependent, of course, but because of the freedom, the private sector in Afghanistan had flourished in the last 20 years, so much as to they had increased the exports of Afghanistan from 200 million in 2002 to $1,000 million exports in 2020. And Afghan people as well, especially its half population women, they had started to take part in the economic development of the country as much as they could. And I'm going to speak about their role in various sectors today, how they had taken part when they had freedom. It's very important to see the role of freedom in development and in growth. Afghan women, when they had freedom, they had taken part in various sectors: government, politics, media, sports, business, education, higher education, and every other sphere of life in Afghanistan. Women in government, for example, last time when Taliban ruled Afghanistan, 1995 to 2001, when they had banned women totally from public life. So in 2002, when Afghanistan's interim government started to be established, there was no women. And then we started having inviting back women to come to their jobs in the government. And in 2021, when again Taliban took over Afghanistan, the number of women in the government had increased 25%. And from 25%, again, we went down to almost none, except the health sector, that Taliban has allowed women to continue providing service to only women. Women health service people to provide services to only women. And women in politics. It's important to mention that the constitution that Afghan people had agreed on in 2004, that constitution had preserved many rights for women and freedom of Afghan people. The rights that the constitution recognized, first of all, it was equal. The constitution mentions equal rights of men and women, minorities and majorities in Afghanistan. And the constitution had also some reservations for Afghan women to participate in the politics of the country, in the policy making of the country. For example, the constitution had reservations for women in the parliament, for women in the provincial councils, and for women in the local development councils. Women in the parliament made 27% in Afghanistan. Women in the provincial councils made 25% in Afghanistan, and women in the local community development councils made 50% of the members. Women in the leadership, as in politics, as ministers, deputy ministers, directors, made 10% by August 2021. We have had a number of women ambassadors that were representing Afghanistan in various countries outside the country. Women had become part of, because they were part of policy-making levels, 27% in the parliament, 25% provincial councils, 50% in the community development councils, 10% leadership, ministers, deputy ministers, ambassadors. They had become part of all policy making in Afghanistan. So they were contributing in the development and as well as in the economic development of the country. Women in education and higher education, which is very important, especially today as we are talking. It has been over 500 days that Afghan girls are banned to attend schools above primary. Only when Taliban took over in August 2021, they only allowed girls to attend from 1 to 5 grades. From 6 to 12 grades, girls were banned. And until today, the ban has continued, including the girls in higher education and universities. When they just got the country, they banned women, female students and female teachers in the higher education as well. But after a few months, when they implemented segregation of space for men and women, in universities and in higher education sector, they allowed them to attend higher education institutions. But then again, on December 24th, 2022, Taliban issued a number of decrees that banned women from higher education as well, from working at NGOs, and banning them from a number of other public spaces as well. But before that, the number of women in the higher education, it's worth mentioning, had reached 23%. Because of the freedom, Afghanistan had over 100 private institutions that were opened in the last 20 years in Kabul and as well as in many of the provinces. And because of the freedom, Afghan girls were not only attending higher education during the normal days, but because some of them were working in NGOs and international organizations, in government and in the private sector companies, they were able to attend their higher education and university classes in the evenings, which all are banned now. In the evenings, especially, there are no girls in the higher education institutions. Women in sports. Women in sports. It's disheartening to mention that that women had entered all sectors in sports. If we all name it, boxing, football, soccer, volleyball, even cricket, even some of the fields that you would not think, bicycling, biking, skiing, skating, some of those very non-traditional sports fields that Afghan women were not introduced to, but they got exposure in the last 20 years. They had entered all those fields. But unfortunately, women in sports as well, it's totally banned for Afghan women to be in any sports fields. Women's movement was another important aspect of women's lives in the last 20 years that had improved so much because of the freedom. But again, as soon as Taliban took over the country, they banned women from moving freely. And there are two issues around women's movement. First, Afghan women, they are required to have a male companion if they are traveling somewhere over 75 kilometers, which should be between 30-35 miles, which is not much. And they have to have a male companion, and if they are caught without a male companion, the posts, military or police posts, they would stop them. They would hold them there. They would call their male family members to come and take that female family member back home, and they would go with the family to their home because they want to have the male family member spend a few hours in prison because he has allowed his female family member to go out without him accompanying her. And the second thing around movement is the covering, the clothing, the way Taliban would like women to be covered, which both have really restricted women from many other public life that they used to participate in the last 20 years. Women in business. Women in business, we, again, if we say, we talk about starting from 2002 with non-women in business to 2021, August 2021, when we had over 2,400 formal licensed businesses around the country. And we have had over 54,500, and we suspect that there were around 60,000, and we had not yet identified them with our data. There were informal businesses that were owned and run by women. And half of the 2,400 formal businesses, they were in non-traditional sectors, which was really a revolution in the private sector for women in Afghanistan. And by non-traditional sector, I mean all the sectors that Afghan women did not have any exposure or had not done those kind of businesses before that. And those businesses were like IT companies, media companies, restaurants, travel agencies, exporting, importing, manufacturing, private schools, private daycares. Those were all kinds of, including some fitness gyms where people would go, especially women, would go for exercise. Most of those non-traditional but formal licensed businesses are closed today, unfortunately. And the number, if we see half of that 2,400 is 1,200. So all of those businesses today are unfortunately closed. But the other half that were in traditional sector, including the 54 or over 54,000 of the informal businesses that were in traditional businesses such as clothing, handicraft, food processing in a very traditional way, food processing and packaging, would be making pickles, jams, drying vegetables, packaging them and selling them in their local markets. Those businesses have continued. This was, I would say, fortunate that from one side, Taliban did not have a specific restriction or policy for women in business to close those businesses, but on the other hand as well, these women's bravery and resilience that they continued at their businesses and continued to be in public as well. So that was really important that they continued. All of these businesses, 2,400 formal, over 54,000 informal businesses owned and run by women in the country. They had created over 130,000 jobs, plus employing themselves, and they had invested $90 million. And now, of course, half of them are gone. In terms of policy-making role for these women in businesses, as in my introduction was mentioned that I had founded Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I want to mention that because of that organization, because of the realization that yes, Afghan women had entered private sector business, but there were no entity to advocate for them, to look into policies for them, and to improve policies for Afghan women in business. This was when I decided, together with a number of women, to establish an organization that would represent Afghan business women and continue advocating for them and continue improving the policy situation for them, or policy environment for them. So with that former government, the Republic, the law that existed in the country in 2015 and 2016 did not allow multiple chambers in the country to function. But because of the freedom, we were able to go all the way to the president of the country and put forward our demand that we need a specific chamber of commerce for Afghan women businesses, because this is the number of women businesses that we have, to serve their needs, to provide services to them, but at the same time to do policy advocacy and continue working with the government to improve policy environment for Afghan women businesses. And in going as high, we managed to take President's permission and take President's decree on the Ministry of Commerce and Industry at that time to change the law. This would not be possible today, because today there is no freedom, there is no advocacy. It's just an authoritarian government even not government, but just a group of authoritarian people ruling the country. And things as such wouldn't be possible at all. So Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce, after the whole process of reaching out to the president and getting president's permission to create this entity and change the law, the entity became one of the strongest chambers in the country, and continued providing policy inputs. And some of the policies that we changed, fortunately, but now unfortunately that we do not have any of those, were, for example, the procurement law for the government. The procurement law for the government, we changed it to provide 5% preference for women-owned businesses. So we started really encouraging government to do business with women. Women started really getting contracts with the government in Afghanistan. And not only with the government, once we made the Afghan government as an example that government accepted to implement that 5% preference and change the procurement law and procurement procedure for us, we went to all the international organizations in the country. The international organizations such as UN agencies, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UCID, all those kind of international entities, embassies, to ask them as well to start thinking about contracting women businesses, to start thinking about allocating their contracts on annual basis to women-owned businesses, because we wanted economic freedom for Afghan women. Our message to those international partners was that you have continued giving us grants, you have continued supporting us, but from now on, we may not need your grants. We need your business. We need contracts. If you do business with us, if you give our women contracts, our women should be able to earn, and our women should be able to as well support not only themselves, but even support their entities, such as this Chamber of Commerce. And so we had started really going towards that direction of freedom, economic freedom. But unfortunately, with the incident of August 2021, when Taliban again regained control in the country, we lost all the progress and accomplishments that we had made, and it was disheartening to see. So in July 2021, we had started planning to send Afghan women business owners to Dubai's Expo 2020. Dubai's Expo 2020, because of COVID, was delayed for 2021, and it was supposed to be launched October 2021. And we had taken a pavilion for Afghanistan as a country, and then in that pavilion, we had reserved a few booths for Afghan women's businesses, and even we were planning a number of fashion shows to show Afghan women's clothing, jewelry, carpet, home decor, and a number of other items that they had started really producing, packaging at international standards. And we had also started to really certify Afghan women's products. We had started an entity to certify Afghan women's products. We called it Made by Afghan Women. And Made by Afghan Women, we were looking into some international standards to work with our Afghan women for their exports. But we had to stop there. But we have not stopped today in the US. Using that name, Made by Afghan Women, we could not do Made by Afghan Women certification, but now we have started selling Made by Afghan Women products through an online sales platform, madebyafghanwomen.com. That in the vision is to make madebyafghanwomen.com an Amazon of Afghan women, Afghan women's products. So the efforts, things are paused in Afghanistan, but we Afghan women have not stopped our efforts to continue supporting women inside Afghanistan, including the institute that I'm working with, Institute for Economic Empowerment of Women, IEW. We've continued educating Afghan women businesses, and these days it's our end of our course. This morning, before attending this event, we had presentations of our Afghan women businesses who went through the 10 weeks long course, and it was creating hope. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Manizha. That was just a wonderful kickoff to the morning. Obviously, you know, there's a lot in there and a lot to unpack, which is why we have so many questions. Try to combine some of them as much. There are a lot of questions around, you know, the barriers that Afghan women are now in. Is it the political? Is it the cultural? Like, what do you view are the biggest challenges? And related to that, are there any opportunities for hope? You know, to maybe persuade the Taliban? From where you're sitting, what do you think on that? What are the biggest challenges? And then can you tell us, maybe, is there an opportunity for hope right now?
Sure. The biggest challenge for women at this moment, as I said, it starts with their freedom of movement, with their access to education, with their access to jobs, especially government jobs, and now also after December 24th decree, their jobs in the NGOs. Those are some of the really biggest challenges: education, higher education. And the other biggest challenge is that Taliban are not ready to talk to Afghan women, or they are talking to the international community. The international community continue meeting them in Afghanistan. The international community continue meeting them in Qatar, where Taliban has their political office. But they're not ready to talk to Afghans. They're not ready for any political settlement. They're not ready for any political inclusivity of the process. It's just them, and they're so rigid with their rules, regulations, and the way they want to rule the country. But the hope is that technology has really, this time, different from 1990s when Taliban ruled. Technology really helped us all to remain connected. Afghan people in diaspora in various countries, US, Canada, Europe, various European countries, Australia, and Afghan people and women inside the country. So we've continued to staying engaged with each other, continued providing education, continued providing support, including monetary support. They've continued raising funds, supporting them, supporting their businesses. Really, I mean, today's connectivity is amazing. And as I said, yeah, thanks to technology.
No, that's really great. We got a lot of questions regarding the U.S. role over there, democracy promotion, state building, all of that. The two main questions seem to center around: why was it so easy for the Taliban to come back in power? And then what's sort of the perception on the ground of the people of U.S. involvement, how things are now, and the look ahead?
Sure. So why it was so easy? This is a very political question, but I'm going to answer it. So first of all, the Qatar government and some of the international international partners, they agreed to allow Taliban to open their political office in Qatar in 2016. In Taliban, at that time, even today, Taliban are considered a terrorist group, a group that supports terrorism. So for Afghan people and for Afghan Republic government at that time, it was very unacceptable, and it was a surprise that how come some governments, including, I have to mention this, and this is unfortunate, including the US government, can accept for a terrorist group that label still, a terrorist group open a political office in Qatar and provide for their expenses. So over 30 members of Taliban's leadership were supported to shift from Pakistan to Qatar with their families, and a number of these international international governments continued supporting financially that Qatar political office and as well as Taliban's leadership. And then all the way from 2016 to 2020, US and a number of international partners continued to talk to Taliban and continued empowering Taliban, so to say, and decreased the leverage of Afghan government and Afghan people to negotiate their terms with Taliban. And last, that really demoralized Afghan people, Afghan government, Afghan military to continue fighting was the US government's agreement that was directly signed. The US government's special representative to Afghanistan's peace, Zalmay Khalilzad, signed an agreement in February 2020 with Taliban in Qatar. And this was again a surprise, I mean a shock, so to say, because from all principles, international principles of how mediation and how reconciliation should happen between an unhappy group, a terrorist, I mean in this case a terrorist group, even not an unhappy political group, in its government, did not happen based on any of those internationally accepted principles. US directly signed an agreement with Taliban, and US government only secured their soldiers safe withdrawal and safely leaving Afghanistan. And on top of that, the US government totally undermined the existence of a legitimate government in Afghanistan, and also people of Afghanistan. If the government, if because of some corruption in the election process, if they didn't think that the government was legitimate, but we were legitimate, Afghan people were legitimate, we were living in the country, we wanted to be included in the process, but even Afghan people were not included in the process. And so the last, when President Biden announced the sudden withdrawal of the troops, and when all the support to the Afghan military was discontinued, this was the time when Afghan military got demoralized. And then Taliban and Taliban's supporters, including Pakistan, Iran, and a number of maybe China and our other neighboring countries. We are in a very critical geographic location. These Central Asian countries, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and then China, Iran, and Pakistan, India. Everybody, all the intelligence investment on the demoralization of Afghan people and Afghan military was immense. And so all of that put hands together and enabled Taliban to take over the country. And this was as easy as it happened. And just over a night, Taliban reached around the capital, and the next day they took over the country.
Thank you for just all of that and your perspective and on the ground knowledge. I can't believe we're almost out of time, so I'm gonna ask one more question, hopefully that you can leave us empowered to make a difference. We got a couple questions around what's one thing that us as individuals around the globe can do to fight and help for women's rights in Afghanistan. Could you leave us with something that we can do on an individual level to help there?
Yes, please continue amplifying our voices. Please continue talking about us. Please continue feeling responsible. Yes, it's a country on the other side of the world from the US, but if you continue talking about us, about girls not going to school, girls not going to university, women not going to jobs, not able to earn, and people in general, 28 million people are living on the mercy of the international community's aid on daily basis to give them bread, rice, oil, in wood for their heating. That's not a life anyone would want to. So please continue talking about us and amplifying our voices. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I know if we were all in the room, we would give you a big round of applause right now. Just thank you for carving the time out to share your perspective and everything you've done. Thank you so much, Manizha.
Thank you for the time. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. And now I'm very excited to pass the microphone over to Mamako Reeves, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you again, Manizha, and over to you, Mamako.
Thank you again so much, Manizha, for your emotional presentation. It really breaks our hearts to the progress you have worked on over the last 20 years. Thanks to your creation of Women Only Chamber of Commerce. You're an amazing mother, wife, advocate, entrepreneur. You teach us, how we can get involved and support this freedom movement, as it can be vulnerable when our respective countries do not get run by appropriate or right leaders. So we admire your courage, resilience, and commitment, and thank you so much for being here. And we'll stand by you, wishing for women would regain basic rights of economic freedom in business, politics, sports, and education, and we'll continue to amplify your voices. So our next speaker comes from Bulgaria. Petar Ganev is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Market Economics in Sofia, Bulgaria. His interests are in the fields of growth and business cycle, fiscal policy, and the role of government, and regional development, free markets, and inequality. And he is studying the history of Austrian School of Economics, and he had served as a chairman of board of Bulgarian Macroeconomic Association about 5-6 years ago. And he has a rich experience in public policy debates and author of numerous articles in Bulgarian media. If you're in for a treat, and his presentation is on economic freedom around the world. So Petar, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. I'm Petar from Bulgaria, Institute for Market Economics. Thank you for the kind invitation, Northwood University. I was here from the beginning, so I think my job will be easier after the first presentation because I need to speak about challenges to economic freedom around the world. It will not be focused on Bulgaria. But after what we just heard, which is so concrete and so obvious, especially when you look from distance, I think it's much easier to now speak about the challenges to economic freedom because we basically hear in much detail from Afghanistan. Institute for Market Economics is the oldest pre-market think tank in Bulgaria. Being around for almost 30 years, advocating for all kinds of free market policies in Bulgaria. I'll have a short presentation. Also, after actually my talk, there is a roundtable which will, I think, cover a similar topic. So basically, this will continue. I hope I can provoke some more questions to be debated after during the roundtable. So I hope you can see the presentation now. Okay, so I'll speak about probably for about 15 minutes on challenges to economic freedom, and then we'll have time for some questions. Starting with some graphics on the economic situation. This is the global trade for the last 15 years. And you can clearly see the two crises that happened. The first one, the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. In the US, it started in 2008, but the recession in Europe was 2009. And then the COVID crisis, the recession that happened. And obviously, the two episodes are extremely different. While the first one was more like a classical crisis, with the financial crisis, following the debt crisis, a debate, you probably heard it, there was even a music video, the usual Keynes versus Hayek debate. So should the government intervene? Is there too big to fail banks or institutions that should be saved by government? Or should we let the market to clear all the wrongdoings from the past? So this is the classical crisis with the classical debate, and it's much longer. Then we have the pandemic, which was a different crisis. We haven't seen such for 100 years probably, and not in modern times. It's shorter, it's deeper, not as you see it here in global trade, but if you look at jobs, during the Great Recession, we were losing jobs for like 2 years. Then we tried to compensate for these jobs for the next 3 or 4 years. In the pandemic, we lost jobs in a few weeks. Basically, in March, the unemployment happened in just a few weeks because everything was closed. And then the recovery was much faster. In 2021, we basically catch up on everything, on all the losses that we did in 2020. So it's a different crisis. And what's similar is that in both crises, the economic freedom is in retreat. This is obvious, and we will see it from. Obviously, when there is a crisis, economic freedom, and I will say human freedom, is in retreat because the governments are stepping up. And of course, the pandemic posted a rather new challenge. As I said, in the past, it was Hayek versus Keynes, but during the pandemic, there are a new set of questions. If you are ordered to not go out from home, which is already hampering your personal freedom, of course, should the government protect your job for a few weeks or a few months, as it happened in Europe, not only, but in Europe heavily, in Bulgaria also. This is a more complicated question even for freedom fighters or free marketeers or whatever you can call, or libertarians. When you're in such situation, all the classical debates seems a little bit different, and we saw a huge increase in government intervention because basically on two sides of the aisle, people were kind of agreeing that some intervention is probably acceptable for a short period of time while you're locked in your home. So it's a different challenge. And then another challenge came after the pandemic. It basically, from the economic point of view, the pandemic is forgotten in 2021. From social point of view, probably a little bit later, or still even maybe going on to some extent. But then the inflation came. And this inflation, which is a global phenomenon, it did not happen only because of the war in Ukraine. It actually began in the mid-2021 from all kinds of factors. We won't get into that here, from the demand, from the supply side. But what is different is that usually in the emerging markets, like Bulgaria or Eastern Europe, it's not so surprising that you have a high inflation like 10% or even 15%. In Bulgaria, 2008, we also have 17% inflation for a period of time. So for us, it's not that surprising, but for the Western world, for the developed economies, this is something new. And you can see it from the graph here that the higher inflation hits everybody. It's not only the emerging markets, it's the developed world. And you can see it clearly here when you see the inflation in Europe, in the euro area. And basically, we saw the return of high inflation in Western Europe, something that hasn't happened in quite some time. In places like Germany, it reached 10% annual inflation, which they haven't seen for decades. Basically, you have people that are born and in their life, they never witnessed. They read in the papers from the past that there was such periods, but they never witnessed inflation different than 2% or 3%. So it's a different situation. It's fueled by the war in Ukraine and the problem with the energy and everything, but not only that, it happened before the conflict. And for me, this is quite a danger to economic freedom. Every time when you have high inflation, there are wider effects, not only in economics, in the country, in our case, in Europe, and this will further hamper economic freedom. And here are some examples. This is just a graph of food price. And actually, in food, you can see episodes from the last 20 years that there are a few episodes when, again, you have higher prices on food. But still, what we're seeing in the last 1 or 2 years, it's governments who are compensating companies for high energy costs. Basically, in almost all of the EU countries, the government is paying part of the bill of every energy bill of every company. In Bulgaria, you pay up to, let's say, $100 per kilowatt, and everything above that is paid by the government. So there is a cap on the price, and it's in the other countries to some extent. So the government is paying a part of your energy bill. They're regulating some of the prices, especially on food, on milk, or whatever is in the eye of the attention now. In Bulgaria now, it's milk and eggs. Every morning you can see debates about the price of milk, speculation and whatever. And then you have increased social spending. Basically, these are some vouchers to the poor so they can afford the higher prices. So basically, after the pandemic, and then to some extent the conflict, the war in Ukraine, now you have the high inflation, which is giving excuse to governments to intervene and to do something that was unthinkable 2 years ago, to pay part of the energy bill or to put a cap on prices. Actually, the strongest policies when it comes to prices were in Hungary. In Hungary, they said that they will put a cap on price, and there will be no hit for inflation. And what happened is that Hungary now has the higher inflation in Europe. It's 26%. So the country that was most intervening basically ended up with the higher inflation. So we're moving out to some graphics on economic freedom using the Fraser Institute. You know, the Fraser Institute, the Heritage Institute, there are different indices. This time I'm showing the economic freedom. This is the global map of the countries from most free to least free. And then you see the average rating for the last 20 years. And here is where you see that the only episodes that the economic freedom is going down is during the crisis in 2008, 2009, and then in 2020, of course, because of the pandemic and all the interventions that happened from social and economic point of view. And then, of course, there are many correlations that you can do with all the data. Something good that we are taking from that we can measure economic freedom is that we can make a lot of papers, and the people from the Fraser Institute are doing that in every annual report. And you can clearly see the relation between the economic freedom and the income per capita or whatever indicator you may. The countries that are freer are richer, with some very few exceptions. In addition to that, I wanted to, again, from a paper from the 2022 Fraser Institute publication, there was a paper dedicated to tracking the relation between the economic freedom and economic crisis. It covers data from 220 economies, economic crisis across 175 countries for 30 years or more. And what you see is that, okay, maybe when the crisis hits and it's a global crisis, it will hit everybody. The countries that are economically free and those that are least free. But the depth of the crisis is different because the countries that are freer, the economies that are freer, they're more diverse. They're not dependent on a single, they don't have a single point of failure. Let's say that you're trading only with Russia, the market is closed and then you collapse. If you're trading to 100 countries, then maybe part of the countries will be in crisis, but the others will be in better shape. So freer economy are more diverse, and then the depth of the crisis is not that deep. And of course, you have a shorter recovery time. Because you're freer, basically you can create jobs faster. And all these effects are driven by the regulatory component in the economic freedom, which means that if it's easier to create jobs and to hire someone, then you're faster to recover from the crisis because you can easily employ those who lost their jobs. If you're heavily regulated, you still lose the jobs, but it's not so easy to create new ones. What is economic freedom good for? It's another paper from the Fraser Institute. And it basically covers all the studies that are looking into the relation of economic freedom indicators with other indicators, social or economic such. And looking at what is, how these papers discuss the relation. Is it a positive? Is it a negative? Or such that is basically uncertain. And the obvious one is that economic freedom is positively related to immigration because it is, I mean, if you're free to travel, then you migrate more with income, with growth, with entrepreneurship, with conflict, with investments, with labor. But what's interesting is what is at the bottom, which are the three indicators that are more troublesome, let's say, or the relation in the papers, it's not so clear. It's corruption, it's environment, and it's inequality. And even in Bulgaria, I think these are the biggest challenges to economic freedom. Because from our economic policies, let's say quite free. I mean, we have the lower taxes, we have free trade with the entire EU. So basically, our economic policies look quite good. But if you want to debate economic freedom, you're debating inequality in the society, what to do with the poor, you're debating environment, and you're debating corruption. So these, I think, are the challenges in the next few years that we need to kind of address from free market standpoint. Also, Fraser Institute are publishing, you probably know the Human Freedom Index, which is a global measure of personal, civil, and economic freedom. So they are now publishing economic freedom and human freedom. Again, you can see a clear relation with the regions that have higher human freedom are more rich based on their income per capita. And you can clearly see in 2020, the effect of the pandemic, how the human freedom score worsened in movement, in expression, in freedom to trade. I mean, if you are locked in home, the freedom to trade basically doesn't work. And I think that obviously in the next 1 or 2 years, this will change positively because we are out of the pandemic now and they will measure it. But we should not be fooled by the part recovery that we'll have in the human freedom index because we are out of the pandemic. Okay, this is normal, but then we have other challenges, including related to the inflation and to the all the regulatory and policies and intervention of the various countries. And this is the last picture that I want to show. This is again the human freedom regional ranking. On the left is Western Europe, on the right is Eastern Europe. You can clearly see the distinction. I mean, on the left, everything is blue. So these are the most free countries and basically quite wealthy countries. And on the right, it's much more diverse. Some countries are part of the EU, others are not part of the EU. Those that are basically least free on this graphic are the ones that are the aggressors. Russia and Belarus in the war with Ukraine. So even here you can see the relation between the state of affairs and the measure of human freedom. But the biggest challenges to those on the right, to Eastern Europe and to Bulgaria and to the other countries, it's not only how to get to the to be more consistent among the most free countries, but also how to catch up economically. Actually, our biggest challenge is, okay, we have 2 decades of growth. How do we continue from now on? Do we enter into the Eurozone? Even this morning we had a debate about that or not. What policies do we undertake? How do we fight with corruption, which is, I think, basically the biggest problem in most of the countries on the right. So it's a much more complicated, and I want to finish with that. The issues that are in front of us, let's say in Eastern Europe, but probably not only, they are not the ones that seem obvious. It's not an issue of, let's say, Frederick Bastiat with the candles and everything. I mean, some obvious restrictions to human and economic freedom. Our issues are more deep. It's do you buy cheap oil from Russia if they're in a war with Ukraine? Do you buy the cheap oil from Russia and sell it to Ukraine, which actually we did? I mean, it's a complicated world with much more complicated issues. And it's not so easy to implement free market ideas which go beyond low taxes, freedom to trade. I mean, we already have that. It's the how do we make a step forward to more challenging ideas related to war, to pandemic, and high inflation and so on. These are the main points that I want to make, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for all that you've given us. We've covered a lot of territory. I can't believe your time is already up. And thank you for covering so many questions from the chat. I think you actually hit most of them during your remarks. But if there's one you missed, we'll make sure that he puts some information in the chat and that you guys can visit the website, because really you're doing so much work on behalf of economic freedom in our world. So thank you again, Petar, for taking your time to be with us here today. We have a very brief break until 10:15 when our panel starts. So if you need to get up, stretch, use the restroom, please do that. And then we'll get back on at 10:15. So thank you again, Petar, and look forward to seeing everyone in just a couple minutes at 10:15 for our panel.